I think the energy these days is just simply unmatched. I think we're expecting about 500,000 people or so for the next few days out of the 2 million that the country is expected to receive from all over the world and across Latin America. I think Mexico is actually one of the most profitable financial systems in the world.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're joined by Salvador Rivero, General Manager of Binance Mexico. Mexico is in the global spotlight this summer, both as a football nation and as one of the most active crypto markets in Latin America. So today, we're going to talk about the excitement around football, the growth of crypto adoption in Mexico, and what the future could look like for millions of Binance users across the country. Salvador, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to host you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
All right, let's dive right in. So Mexico is hosting matches from one of the biggest football tournaments in the world this summer, with the whole world watching you. What's the energy right now in Mexico, both as a football fan and as someone who's running a business over there?
Well, honestly, it's something unlike we haven't seen any time before, at least not in my lifetime. I'm originally from Mexico City. I think the energy these days is just simply unmatched. I think we're expecting about 500,000 people or so for the next few days out of the 2 million that the country is expected to receive from all over the world and across Latin America. I don't know if you saw it over the news, but Colombian fans took over Reforma, which is one of the most iconic avenues in the city before their match. Korean fans did the same in Guadalajara. The Colombians did it again in Guadalajara before their match again. So the city and the country, I would say, is buzzing, with activity and football fans. And that obviously, has been translating directly into economic activity. I think you see it on the streets, in restaurants, in transits. And of course, we see it in Binance as well. The Binance Card essentially has been growing pretty much consistently, with double digits week over week over the past month or so. And of course, when such big economic activity accelerates, like this, then obviously digital payments kind of start actually displaying, why they're super important infrastructure, to sustain this economic activity momentum.
This sounds really exciting. And obviously, big sporting moments often bring a wave of national pride and international attention. So beyond football itself, are you seeing any impact on consumer confidence, spending, or economic activity in Mexico?
I think, there's an enormous, I would say, sense of pride in Mexico at the moment. We have, of course, the magical, Estadio Azteca, which is one of the most legendary stadiums in the world. This is where Maradona scored the goal of the century against England, where Brazil, became champions as well with Pele. And that's obviously something we're very proud of. And of course, beyond that pride, I think this has been an opportunity to showcase what Mexico really is in terms of, the cultural heritage, of course, the food, the warmth of the people. I think the country is expected to generate, well over $2-3 billion in extra revenue. So that's obviously, direct impact that's very much welcome in these 7 days.
Well, let's talk about crypto adoption as a backdrop of the tournament. Obviously, Mexico is one of the most active crypto markets in Latin America, and it saw more than $71 billion in crypto transaction volume over the past year. So what do those numbers tell us about who's using crypto in Mexico today and what's driving that adoption?
Well, we'd just like to start with some data. Actually, I think Mexico is actually one of the most profitable financial systems in the world. With ROEs that tend to be above, I would say, 20% or so, and the market is super highly concentrated. With 6 banks controlling over 70% of the market. So, I guess for business and you could also say for policy reasons, banks tend to be quite risk averse. So they tend to focus a little bit more on kind of like on top of the pyramid. And they tend to charge high fees for basic services. So I would say most people in Mexico tend to be either priced out of the financial system or just simply underserved, and that's, I think, precisely what's driving crypto adoption, whether it is client facing or just in the form of infrastructure. Crypto, for instance, or in Binance in particular, is starting to actually bring, I would say, real access, opening a current account, without actually having to have a bank account as such. making payments, through local rails or, international rails as well, accessing both crypto and traditional investments at a fraction of the cost. And I think, that those, $70 billion or so in volume that you spoke about, I think tells you, like where I think kind of like the market is probably past the early stage, of adoption. And but I would say we're still pretty early in terms of utility, though. Crypto in Mexico is still mostly used for trading and treasury purposes, but we are actually starting to see some real use cases emerge. Especially in the cross-border payments and FX space. So there's, I think, where the volume actually starts translating into everyday impact.
Speaking more on the use cases, and as you mentioned, cross-border payments and remittances remain an important part of daily life for many people in Mexico, as you mentioned. How are crypto and stablecoins changing the way money move across borders?
That's a really good question. As you know, Mexico's geographic location is pretty strategic. It's one of the busiest borders that exists, obviously, with a huge, economic dynamism and a large Mexican diaspora in the US. And so, in this context, Mexico is the world's second largest actually remittance recipient with over $60 billion a year. This is done, over 12 million transactions, and this actually benefits almost 2 million households in the country. The average transaction for those remittances is a little bit over $400. And they're actually quite expensive. In most cases, the cost of sending those to the families in Mexico is well above 4%. And I think that's where, stable coins are actually kind of like starting to change the equation. We're seeing both new and traditional players, tapping into stable coins to actually start reducing those costs, to bring them down to like 1% to 2% maybe. And obviously, they're starting to integrate as well with local payment rails, which is, super important because you have to meet the people where they are. So we now have, like cards, cash out points, and then a proper integration with SPAY, which is for real-time payment system. And, within this context, I think the potential is actually huge. The potential is to basically put about $150 million or so back into families' pockets, that today are actually lost to fees. But I would say the biggest opportunity is probably cross-border trade. The cross-border corridor moves more than $1 trillion a year. Businesses tend to pay an average of 3 to 4% per transaction, and they tend to wait about 1 to 3 days or so, longer on the weekends, of course, for settlement. Stablecoins are actually starting to bring that cost down, again, to 1 to 2%, depending on the amount, with instant settlement, ultra competitive FX. And this is obviously again, structural shift, in how money moves between the two economies, and especially at this scale, which is absolutely massive.
And out of all of the shifts and developments that you've just mentioned, what recent development in crypto are you perhaps most excited about because it could make a real difference for everyday users in Mexico?
Yeah, I guess for me personally, this obviously a very personal point of view is the tokenization, for world assets. The reason is I'm excited about this is just because it's basically directly tied, to Mexico's reality. Again, gonna throw in some numbers, but Mexico is a primarily cash-based economy, in more so than any comparable economy in terms of size and population. Just for you to get an idea, like over 85% or so of all transactions under $30 equivalent are actually made in cash. And then for transactions that are above $30, only 19% are made with a debit or credit card. And so that tells you a little bit about kind of like the low, financial services penetration, and that is still pretty low. Only 37% or so of adults have any type of credit. Only 22% of adults have any type of insurance. And this is very striking, like only 2% of adults actually have an investment account. Only 2% have also only bought crypto. And yet people who do have financial services actually rely heavily on apps, to manage them. So it's itself an economy that is highly digital, like with very low financial services access. I think, as I said before, most people in Mexico are either priced out of financial services or not served by traditional players, or they just don't have, for instance, the credit history to access credit. And I think tokenization actually changes that access problem, from this side. It takes essentially assets, that were previously illiquid or inaccessible, like real estate. People tend to love real estate in Mexico, for instance. Treasury bills, commodities, traditional stocks as well. And I think it just makes them, divisible and available through essentially a smartphone. And so it creates actually more incentives, for people to join kind of like the financial market and the financial services, and so for a market, as I said before, that only 2% of adults have an investment account, this is actually door opening.
I want to take a bit of a step back and talk about the system behind these use cases. So Mexico has an opportunity to build a regulatory framework that could become potentially a model for the whole region. So what does good crypto regulation look like? And what still needs to happen to get there?
Yeah, I mean, of course, regulation is a super important cornerstone, in the development of the industry. It provides obviously certainty and a protection to both users and companies. And when done correctly, it really actually drives adoption because people trust, essentially what's regulated. And I think good crypto regulation has to essentially solve three things in parallel. I'd say clarity for operators, real protection for users, and then enough flexibility not to stifle, innovation before it actually matures. And of course, it needs to be kind of like, I'd say sequentially, little by little. So I think the first step in Mexico is a stablecoin regulation. So this essentially would create kind of like the foundation for everything that comes next, certainty, speed, and low cost in transactions. Stablecoins are already, as I said before, moving real money across the border today. So regulating them properly means establishing kind of like an on-chain settlement layer, that the broader financial system can build on top of. And then following this idea, obviously the second step would be, as I said before, tokenization, like of traditional and non-traditional assets. I think that's where kind of like regulation enables broader access and capital formation. You open up investment opportunities for people. You provide more liquidity as well for people who are raising money, and you give access to this different types of assets, to that outside were previously limited to institutional or high net worth individuals. And so I think this would be kind of like a big structural shift, like if we can make that happen. And so the opportunity for Mexico, again, is to build this something that kind of like becomes a regional reference, I would say, not by being necessarily the most permissive or the most restrictive, but by being for sure the most clear, like with a clear kind of like long-term path into what we want to become in terms of a financial system. And of course, this framework, start with stable coins, establish that settlement layer, and then open the door to tokenization.
When it comes to Binance, as crypto adoption grows in Mexico, what responsibility do companies like Binance have beyond just simply offering products and services?
I think it's a really good question. I think it's twofold. I think the first would be education. Obviously, as the industry grows, Binance should be and is, of course, at the forefront of educating people on the benefits, the risks, and the real opportunities of crypto and blockchain and financial services. I spoke a little bit about how many people had actually bought crypto in the past, only 2%. I think education is not a nice to have. It's actually a very important gateway to adoption. People need to understand what they're using before they trust it with their money, and that's something that we're obviously doing, through Binance Academy and real events, I would say, on a monthly basis. And then the second one is institutional responsibility. Companies of our scale have data, infrastructure, and operational experience that regulators and policymakers need to make good decisions, essentially. So sharing that knowledge, proactively participating in public consultations, proposing technical standards, engaging with regulators rather than just waiting for the rules to be imposed. I think that's essentially how we can and we should build an ecosystem, not just a business. As Binance has secured licenses in Argentina, in Brazil, in El Salvador, and on Mexico, precisely because we have invested in those relationships. And obviously that responsibility doesn't end, when the license is granted. It just barely starts there, so that's where we'll build from.
Well, speaking of user growth, and if you had an opportunity, and now you have an opportunity to address someone who is new to crypto, someone new in Mexico, what's the first practical problem that it can solve for them?
I guess, it's a really good question, but I guess it really depends on who that person is. I think everyone has very specific problems, that we obviously try to solve by building products here at Binance. But I'll say in Mexico, the most immediate is probably cross-border payments. Like if you have a family abroad, receiving money, whatever through traditional channels tend to cost you, as I said before, well above 4%, and it really can't take base. So with stablecoins and that integration that we have, the local payment rails, that the same transfer, like we can make that happen in minutes essentially, and cut the cost by more than half. So obviously difference tends to stay with your families. That's obviously a huge win. And then, if you're, for instance, a freelancer, working with international clients, you can actually get paid in crypto from anywhere in the world, without the bureaucracy essentially of traditional wire transfer. And of course the fees, that come with it. So that's the second one, and then a third one I would say is, if you're someone with savings in, say, local currency in pesos, and you're concerned about inflation, obviously stablecoins also give you access to hard currency investments, without actually needing a foreign account.
Thank you, Salvador. And finally, to wrap up, let's look into the future. Binance is evolving beyond a crypto exchange into a broader financial platform that includes payments, savings, and investing. Imagine we're having this same conversation again in 2030. What do you hope will have changed for the average person in Mexico?
This is a super interesting question. This is something I actually think about quite a bit. I think technology tends to move a little bit like that. At first you have kind of like this feeling that everything is moving really, really slow. But then once it catches on, then it just moves really, really, really fast, right? So I think in 4 years' time, my hope is that the question is not necessarily longer, what is crypto? The question should be, which app do I use to manage my money? And I think Mexico has every ingredient, to get there. We have a young population that's connected, obviously, a remittance corridor that's important and that really demands efficiency, also in terms of obviously trade. And we have, millions of people who actually need access to financial tools that the system hasn't necessarily provided. And I think, at Binance here in Mexico, we're building towards that, payment through local rails, access to investments, savings tools, cross-border transfers, all in one place, and obviously regulated and safe for them. I think the work that we're doing today, also in terms of regulation, education, and infrastructure, is what I think will make that reality possible. And, hopefully for the average person in Mexico, the change is that they will be able to access, financial services that are as easy as opening an app, that are super fast, that are also super, super cheap, and that actually, lets them improve and take control of their financial situation. And I think that's essentially the baseline, towards we should be building toward.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful future. And thank you for sharing this with us. And thank you for sharing your insights and joining us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to follow Binance for more videos like this one. And thanks for watching.